So hello, everyone, and welcome to another conversation of the fourth cycle of conversations on corporeal architecture. My name is Maria da Piedade Ferreira, and I am very happy to welcome today Chika Daniels. Dr. Chika Daniels Akunekwe is an architect, researcher, and instructor in the School of Architecture, Planning, and Landscape in the University of Calgary. She studied architecture, planning, and urban design at the OOU in Nigeria, at the NU at United Kingdom, and UOFC in Canada. Chika has authored several papers that explore architectural phenomenology, specifically social housing, performativity, and integration within non-poor communities. Chika has co-designed and co-delivered workshops in a series titled Equity Means Architecture, which focuses on pursuing social-spatial justice in building design. Chika, thank you so much for accepting my invitation.
Thank you so much for having me, Maria. It's very good, and it's a privilege to be part of the great minds you convened in this fourth cycle. So it's really an honor for me. So I'm glad you're having me as well, and it's good to see your students. Is it okay for me to start? Can I just go right ahead?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, let me start sharing my screen. Is this good?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, awesome. So good morning, everyone. I'm happy to be here. So in the next few minutes, I'll just speak very briefly on the experience of engagement, the critical role of phenomenological studies in social housing design. So this is actually a paper that I co-authored in 2019 with a very similar title, which focuses on development of successful social housing design being contingent on eliciting and utilizing experiential information collected over time by occupants or by the residents via the application of phenomenological methodology. So in terms of an outline, I'll just run through the presentation in 5 parts, and I'll start off by talking about definitions, just because in the context of this study, things take on different meanings. So I'll just like to really clarify that aspect. And then I'll try to set a context, and I'll ground my study within certain boundaries. And then I'll try to define the problem, because I'm talking about experience. So I'm really going to be talking about whose experience are we really sort of trying to bring to the forefront, bring up front and center. And then next, I'll talk about the goals of the study, the methods and the findings and the things we discovered, and how we feel like these are valuable information. And then as I round up this teaching or presentation, I'll be talking about the speculations of what I believe that this study now has in terms of academia and just social housing studies, and also the value for the future of what this study could be. Okay, so in terms of defining keywords, so in this particular study, we considered experience to mean that which is personal, subjective, and intentionally directed towards a specific object of interest. So in architecture and design, for instance, we define experience to denote, like sustained practice, outside reflection, a first-person observation and engagement. And to be honest, while all 3 provide rigor, I think perhaps more so engagement in terms of having lived within the confines of a space in question is recognized particularly as being, capable of delivering unique insight to design. This observation and engagement, it ranges from a resident's recurrent arrival at a development, through mode of travel to and around that development, mostly typically pedestrian, to their circulation through the building, their use of the building, their perception of details internally and externally, like, lighting, like color as well. So what in this context is Pardon me. So what in this context is engagement? So there are several ways engagement can be defined, within the various forms of interaction. So there are at least 3 ways to consider engagement. There's contextual, there's social, and there's emotional. But again, these are across myriad dimensions. So there's face-to-face, there's empathic, and there's user. So for this particular study, I will focus on user engagement because that's what I'm really looking at, how people really engage through use with the building. But before I try to define what this user engagement means, I just want to really say that, without context, engagement is really just noise. Humans are emotional creatures, and we deliver contextual relevance. And delivering contextual relevance is critical to reinforcing emotional value invested. In terms of social engagement, it's centered around interactions, and not just during the period of direct connection with the object, but before and after interaction. It's important that we understand experience and engagement because it lends itself to why we think that using phenomenology as a methodology is critical for this study. And again, it just lends itself to our whole idea of centering this study around the principle of consciousness and around description being the operative word here. So in terms of that user engagement I mentioned a few minutes ago, is really about the involvement a user has with a system. And it's not really about the choice you make to engage with that system, but it just originates by virtue of being around the system. So again, I'll try to define social housing. So social housing, the origins are rooted in Europe. And over the years, as it has spread across the globe, it has taken on myriad forms. And it's one of those words that are classified as a floating signifier because there's not an agreed upon meaning of the word. So it has changed and it has morphed in meaning as it has appeared in several different contexts. So social housing really defines itself based on the context being mentioned or being spoken about. But there are many things that it can represent. So a few of those things are, one is the country's housing situation. 2, the needs determined by the government authorities of the households unable to compete in the housing market for adequate and affordable housing. 3rd, it can also represent, I think about 4 context-specific circumstances, like, the history of a place, the culture of a place, the politics, the economy as well. And again, in terms of representation, it also represents a constant alteration and evolution of housing systems. And finally, social housing can also represent what the government considers the housing need to be. So it's really one of those things that you can't quite say social housing means this. So for instance, in Germany, social housing is provided to support households which would otherwise not be able to find appropriate accommodation on the housing market. And the same is the case in Nigeria. So in Nigeria, social housing is provided to ensure that households or individuals who are unable to gain access to housing at the market rates have access to shelter. So in Nigeria, it's not really quite known as social housing. It's known as low-cost housing. But in terms of what represents social housing in Nigeria, it's low-cost housing. Now, if you look at the images on the slide, the image with the blue background is a very popular, I want to say renowned social housing. It's called the HFT housing in Netherlands. And then at the bottom right, the orange building is, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but it's the Fuggerei. It's social housing in Germany. And I think it's the oldest social housing still standing, about 500 years old now. And then on the left is the ERZ social housing in Austria. So again, this just gives us an idea of how varied social housing can look depending on context. But I want to answer a question, and it's why social housing? So in 1994, Michael Harlow, in his book called Social Housing, The Past, Present, and Future, he named social housing the housing of the future. And because it's vital infrastructure to the urban and economic growth of cities. And there was a study conducted in 2018, and based on that study, with every new social housing unit generated, 2.3 jobs were also made. So that just shows you how social housing has like a kind of multiplier effect, especially when you think of it in the aspect of the economy. So this slide is really just to show you how, again, in Nigeria and Germany, social housing might mean sort of similar things, but they look completely different. So again, it just reflects the country, what the government makes social housing to be, the value also that the government puts on this housing type as well. So it just shows how vast, social housing can really, what it can really mean based on the different contexts in question. Okay, so as we move on, I want to just set the context and sort of really just place this study within certain boundaries. So in terms of grounding the study within certain boundaries, I think the first boundary would be that defined by phenomenology and with regards to human experience being at the center of this study. So not just human experience, but the way certain things present themselves to us in and through such experience, how we interpret it, and what we see as significant. So the study of experience, has been made increasingly popular by the term user experience. And I believe it was coined in the early 90s by one of the then Apple executives, but while it became popular then, it has existed for several centuries preceding. It just manifested in different dimensions and different forms. So in ancient China, there was a term called feng shui, which was really about the importance of space, about arranging our surroundings in the most optimal, harmonious, and user-friendly way. Following this era was the era of, ergonomics, which was kind of brought to the forefront through the ancient Greeks, that really focused on designing workplaces based on principles centered around understanding our interactions, human interactions and other elements of a system to kind of produce a design evidencing optimized human well-being and overall system performance. Following this period in Greece, there came an era called the Taylorism, which was in the early 1900s, pioneered by Frederick Winsor Taylor, who was on a quest for kind of like workplace efficiency, sort of trying to think of ways to design workplace in a way that it would kind of elicit the superior performances from those who worked or functioned within the space. Following this was the period of Toyota and, really trying to engage human input and kind of putting value on human input as well. And Toyota basically just built on the work of Taylor, which was about usability and just, again, testing that usability. After that was the period of Henry Dreyfuss in the 50s, who really focused on the art of designing for people. He had a very popular quote, which was that, when the point of contact between the product and the people becomes a point of friction, then the designer has failed. But on the other hand, people are made safer, more comfortable, more eager to be efficient, or just happier by contact with that product, then the designer has indeed succeeded. So this was the individual who really started the art of designing for people, really people-centric design. I mean, following him were about 3 or so more eras. In 1960s, we had Walt Disney, creating kind of these near perfect user experiences. In the 1970s, we had Xerox, we had Apple, and the personal computer era. Again, focusing on individual user experience. And then there came the 90s, where Donald Norman, the executive at Apple, then gave this study a name called user experience. But in architecture, while this relationship between architecture and phenomenology is obvious, and in many cases even necessary, and fundamental to the success of architectural endeavor, its reach within the field has not really been maximally exploited. So this relationship, the one between architecture and phenomenology, popular called AP, I'll be calling it AP going forward, has been fundamentally the responsibility of the architect. So within this study, the argument we put forward is this. While this specific reference to the role of the architect in AP is valid and relevant, there's even a more important perspective, which does exist, and that refocuses us from the architect. And it is one that is motivated by Palazzma's theories. Some of the theories he shared in 2005, which were dedicated to more in-depth connection users have with their buildings. And then finally, in terms of setting the context, there are several different dimensions via which the opinion of the user can be sought. So in order to provide a boundary for our study, we thought to ourselves, what are the chief issues associated with dissatisfaction experienced with social housing design by the user? And then we found these to be 2 things. One is siting, so where these buildings are located, and the other is maintenance. And interestingly, these have very strong ties with design. So despite this being popular knowledge, the phenomenon has still not really been extensively studied, specifically at the urban, public, and the residence or the household levels. So siting, we consider this in terms of, orientation of the design and balancing the demands of the users against analysis showing appropriate choices in building orientation, in geometry, building envelope, programming, and among many other things. And then maintenance, just basically in terms of the poor quality of design, how these housing developments are tended to supervised, preserved following completion of construction. So this is a very popular saying by Frank Chimero. And I found this quote in his very, very popular book called The Shape of Design. It's very simple, it's very honest, but it's about positioning the user up front and center, about ascertaining that our designs really capture the elements which on the part of the user ensure pleasure and satisfaction and the desire for continued accommodation of the space. So while I reference this quote, the idea behind it is not quite novel because subliminally, in the mind of many or most architects, there's the awareness of the need to prioritize our clients or the user experience, the user expectation. And this can be achieved by, very meticulous consultation, planning, analyzing, investment of time, continued revisions. Very often the outcome, while it is efficient, it generally lacks the quality of being desirable. It lacks that distinctiveness, that element of it that represents the client, represents the user. Rather, it becomes an additional display of identifiers that have now been known, to be tied to the architect. So somehow, while we know this, we continue to miss it as architects as we deliver design. Now, let me attempt to define the problem. So typically, housing design decisions, and specifically housing created for the public or for public use, are made by the architects or, for instance, architectural teams, and in some cases, in collaboration with housing authorities or administrators, on the assumption that together as a team, the possibility increases that they could prefer very favorable designs. Now, if you think back to the beginning of the 21st century, however, housing design processes began including residents, and this revolutionary turn really grounded studies that indicated that, if you had a bigger team, it's possible that the design could be stronger, it could be very highly functional. I mean, the solutions could be exactly what the user or the client needs. So despite this knowledge, architects continue to approach design with the answer in advance. So we maintain a kind of selective listening. And then, after we've spoken to the client and heard only the things we want to address in the design, we then move on to fellow architects who are the only people who can really understand the jargon we employ to discuss these issues. So architects forget that architecture is the expression of the thing and not the thing itself. So it's up to the architect to decide which function they really want to express with the form. The expression is what allows architecture to be part of and facilitate a conversation about our values as a society. It is architecture's most important role to really deliver what is requested and not just to do what we feel like is most suited. So here's what Yohani Pallasmaa had to say about it, and I'll just read the quotes on the screen. So architects have made architecture excessively complicated by compiling many irreconcilable and conflicting categories of thought, emotion, interaction, and action, when it should really be about encounter and experience, because architecture should be encountered and lived rather than understood intellectually. Here's another very popular quote by Alejandro Aravena. And so he's basically just saying that the implication of approaching design with preconceived solutions and selective listening is that rather than asking what the problem is, we're focused on providing the answer. So we already, just a very quick scenario is you get to what could be a possible, invitation to a client. And upon just hearing what the use is, you begin to conceive all these ideas of what you could, what could be the solution to that problem without having even discussed with the client yet. So Arvina is saying here that rather than asking what the problem is, we're so focused on providing the answer, and there's nothing worse than answering the wrong questions well. In the same article where this quote was pulled from, Arvina, who is really known to be like a leader among this newer generation of socially minded architects, he insists that architecture must have like a starting point that is as far away from architecture as possible. As far away from architecture as possible. It should be really about understanding the user, what affects them, the kinds of things that affect their daily lives. And it is only after the acquisition of the knowledge, on the user or about the user that design can then commence. And then you could now add on the information collected. So this marriage then forms the foundation for the creation of what could then be a solution. The alternative to this is failing to really capture the need. And this is historically most prevalent among residents of proper housing, which is an umbrella term, for housing typologies built for those who are the most disadvantaged in communities. So what Aravena really proposes is a kind of participatory approach to design and even to social projects, which he suggests should be founded on the understanding that the architect's ideas and the reality of everyday life of people should definitely be connected. So I want to move into the third section of the presentation, which is the goal of the study, the methods, and the findings from the study as well. So, I mean, just sharing the thoughts from Aravena in the previous slides, it kind of gave us a bit of a head start as we approached, this study. So we then thought to ourselves, what would be our hypothesis? And we have hypothesized that residents should not only be included in designs, in discussions, about design, social housing designs, but they should actually be front and center in the design phase, and that the information collected from these users would constitute, would kind of be based on their first person engagement with that object of interest, and would then complement the expertise of the architects and the architectural team. So, I mean, because otherwise we found that if it wasn't quite done in a way where the users are up front and center, it would then result to what has become the norm in countries like Nigeria, where social housing is pretty much always abandoned or vandalized or underutilized, or just has a general dissatisfaction synonymous with this housing type. So we hypothesized that information gathered from the users, in this case, the residents, should be applied in identifying certain design elements to be incorporated into the design of social housing. So this quote by Lewis Kahn captured the essence of what our study anticipated in terms of what the achievement could be. So it reads, a great building must begin with the unmeasurable. So again, if you cast our mind to the last few slides, where we've spoken about how, the design solutions should really start as far away from architecture, from actual tangible, ideas, should start with the unmeasurable, and then it must go through measurable means, which is at the point where you now involve the architect, who is kind of an expression or the tool for which that design idea is manifested. And then when it is being designed, and in the end, it must then be unmeasurable. So it should then be able to elicit that feeling of satisfaction, of home, of place for the user. So in order to proceed to really talking about the goal of the study, we first had to develop at least one assertion, and it was that the success of social housing developments can be measured by assessing the quality of the residents' everyday experiences of the phenomena of place, and that capturing this experience can provide important inputs into the design of future social housing developments. So we then set out to prove the validity of the statements. So our goal therefore became to determine if there is a difference between the elements that architects consider necessary in social housing design compared to those, really kind of underscored or emphasized by the residents, by the user. So to carry out this study, we needed to consider existing social housing developments from both sides. So from the side of the architects and the side of the users. And then to understand the architect's decision, it required really studying the design and the existing structure. So in the Nigerian context, what obtains is actually quite hilarious. The design of social housing is a process that completely excludes the user and is entirely the responsibility of the architect. entirely the architect's responsibility. Therefore, the portion of the study, studying the aspect of the architect was very easy because it really just meant us, going to planning offices, getting plans, getting approval, the drawings that were approved, and really just looking at them because we had already come to know that these were 100% the brainchild of the architects. But then looking at the other side of the study was very difficult because it required very extensive field work. And then by employing that AP concept, architectural phenomenology, we had to really, elicit accounts of lived experience from the users. So AP was really critical to our data collection because it had to be this individualistic way users perceived the building, seen without any presuppositions. It was a kind of, observing these buildings unencumbered by any pre-given idealistic or realistic views. Now, to really dive deep into kind of getting the information we required for the study, we had to choose a method known as the embedded case study. And I mean, it's like the typical case study, but it differs in the sense that it refers to a study that has more than one unit of analysis. So where one unit consists of a whole study. And we adopted a research strategy that allowed us to use mixed methods approach. So on the qualitative side of our studies, we employed literature review. We had to review policy documents, again, phenomenology, which allowed us to really employ methods like field personal observation, semi-structured interviews, focus group discussions. And on the other side, the quantitative side, we utilized surveys. Now in Nigeria, we found there to be about 23, different developments ranging from between 1,300 to about 2,000 units, and they comprise the four main kinds of typology. So single bed, 1, 2, and 3 bedroom units. Now, these 4 developments we selected comprised a mix of all kinds of units, those that had been vandalized, had been abandoned, underutilized, and were still occupied. And we thought that this would provide us a very robust, potentially robust participant sample. And so we got into the entire thing of, the field observation, which spent almost 5 hours per day, really literally just observing. We put together an interview sample of about 51 participants across the 4 neighborhoods. We had a target of 1,600 surveys. We hit about 1,300. And then we collected about 220, which were completed and which was enough because we're sort of trying to aim at getting 10% of 1,600 surveys back. So via this methodology, and alongside validating our hypothesis that AP would play a key role in kind of assembling the information that we required, our results were really achieved. So the AP helped us to really kind of look through the lens of one of Palasma's very popular work, which is The Eyes of the Skin. And it revealed to us multiple dimensions via which we could consider really understanding experience and engagement with place by the user. The first thing it helped us to see was an observation of architecture from within, from within the person's consciousness who is experiencing it. The second thing was really just looking at the essence of things, unburdened by convention or by intellectualized explanations. The third thing was that it wasn't just really merely about analyzing formal features or the characteristics of the building and their stylistic properties, but it was about trying to understand the inner language of these buildings. The fourth thing was, existential human sensations, which are strongly rooted in our consciousness. The fifth was affirming or otherwise if and how the space had really integrated with the person's self-identity and if the users identify themselves in this place. And then finally, it was really considering as to if this place fulfilled basic conditions, emotional feelings, existential aspects of human beings, does this place fortify human misery or does it alleviate it? So it was about really qualitative attributes. How well was the building expressed? How well did the building express intentions or the purpose of the user? How well are the values of the user and their motivations for building in the first place really expressed? And does the building uplift spirits of those who inhabit it? Does it enhance the surroundings? When, excuse me, when these qualities are manifested in the building, does it then become like, a kind of facilitator of conversation about what is important to us in a community? So there are so many things that just looking at Palasma's work helped us to really kind of dig deep in our study as we try to understand this engagement and experience of those who lived in social housing and how they really encountered the place, and also have an idea of what to ask them as we kind of studied them, and also what to expect in terms of what we could use to now begin to design, what we could term successful social housing. So we found that a necessary first step was to really identify individuals that qualify to participate, in this study by developing a set of criteria. And what were these? So because the information we required from the user was really sort of contingent on many things. One of those things was, genuine interest in the phenomenon that we were studying. Another was how long they had lived within this area, this building, this project, these developments. The third was a good grasp of our studies investigation, information that was to be collected and also the objectives. In addition to these three primary criteria, we also thought that the participants had to be a person who maybe had abandoned the accommodation due to a mismatch or dissatisfaction with it, being unable to meet its needs, but someone that we could have access to anyways. Also, it could be someone who had witnessed these social housing developments, begin to really deteriorate and become abandoned. Also, it could be someone who was of an age that allowed them to really be aware of what was going on with the development, as maybe during the time of construction or as it began to fail its users. Another thing we found that was very important was, the people had to be of an age that allowed them to form an opinion about the situation, and not just basically reciting to us things that they had heard in other discussions, but things that they had also begun to kind of sense or experience themselves living in these developments. And then finally, it was critical that whoever we found should be able to communicate their clear and detailed accounts of their experiences during the period of the occurrence within these developments. So this study now helped us to really obtain these people's personal experiences, very detailed descriptions of users who had witnessed all kinds of things. So for instance, some of the people that we interviewed had kind of observed the government's decision to build the social housing developments. They had also identified, kind of like issues with the developments by themselves. They had also been there and watched planning and design processes commence, outside of the involvement of them who were going to be living in these developments. Another thing that we found as we spoke to these people who we had identified was that there were some who had kind of witnessed the design being implemented, during developments or construction, even up until occupancy. So we began to get all these different kinds of information, just filter through our participant group. we thought that the next step to take was to collect this information and analyze it, and then beginning with the interviews, we could really elicit all this data from our participants and then, apply surveys in 2 forms, which would help us to really confirm that what this interviewee group were sharing were things that people really felt on a larger scale within the community of those who lived in these social housing developments. And then so it helped us to really kind of compile all these things and begin to filter them down so that as we kind of, concluded our research within the community, we're able to develop, what we called a kind of a concise version of all the desires and requests that the users of these developments had found to be critical to them to really enjoy living in these developments. So, I mean, the results were very surprising because it showed us that the users really know what they want. And it made us to keep on asking other questions. And one of which was, if we've had users, occupants this whole time who are very clear what they require from social housing, why are we still designing social housing wrong? Why are we still designing social housing that keeps failing the clients, the users? For instance, if you look at the Nigerian context, I mean, Nigeria hasn't built any new social housing for decades. But as much as the need is urgent and is critical, the housing that exists is barely occupied because it doesn't in any way satisfy the use of those who really need it. So in terms of siting, what did we find? We found that the users want to be involved very early on in the process of even defining the search area for where these developments would eventually be constructed. Which means that all this time that we've thought that they wanted to be involved in the design stage, that's already very late. They want to be there very early on, even before the government decides, we're going to situate social housing here, we're going to put it here, we're going to put it here. They want to be involved in that very early, very initial stage. So they need assurance on zoning and on land use. They need confirmation that defines such area for social housing must be in an area designed for and therefore appropriate for residential developments. And they laid emphasis on the importance of zoning and land use because of the significance of feeling that they're a feeling of neighborhood and proximity to other uses that just kind of support life and living. So similarly, there were suggestions to ensure that potential sites were areas where there was no news of any negatively impactful environmental influences. Also, there were numerous comments about just the sites, like site capacity, site adequacy, site utilization. So one of the complaints we kept on having was about how cramped and congested these projects often felt. So what had transpired was architects who were designing these spaces, with no consideration for circulation. So, I mean, there are people among the pool who were complaining of having eventually gotten opportunities where they were drivers and then couldn't even find places to park the vehicles that they were driving. So all of these things were coming up as flaws with the design of social housing. And it was manifested in such a profound manner because users were being invited very late in. Thanks, Maria. Yeah, so they were invited very late in terms of, when they were coming to participate in the whole process. Same thing happened with maintenance as well. So I'll just try and move on a little bit more quickly. So the same issues we found with maintenance. So very quickly, I want to just talk about what we found in terms of value, in terms of the speculations of meaning. So one thing we thought was that having done a study like this, it would really awaken architects, particularly those that practice in the study context, to the importance of, involving residents, not as an afterthought, but as a necessary part of the team from the initial design stages, from the very early on stages. Also to educate architects on what constitutes successful social housing and how it can be achieved based on translating residents, complaint, suggestion to a corresponding or equivalent design element. Third thing we thought could be kind of a supposition, would be that this could advance the general knowledge or understanding of social housing for the design team and for the government, by adding on this additional layer of information available for design and improvement of social housing. We also thought that it would be a kind of, alert to residents about their responsibility in really observing their housing developments so that they can be a part of the improvement process. And then finally, in terms of speculations, would be that this would encourage governments, to begin to think about social housing more positively, that it could really be successful. And while these aren't like novel speculations, we just feel like the more we're able to shed light on these issues, then it begins to really draw attention to them so that, as it becomes part of that snowball that triggers action. So very quickly, in terms of value, the current literature shows that what happens in the context of our study is that residents are invited to participate in the process, when it has already been completed. So they're basically just coming on to assess an already finished product, to do a kind of like satisfaction survey. And at this point, it's already too late. So our study really emphasizes, kind of inviting residents prior to commencing the project. And this study really kind of sets itself apart in terms of its sharp focus on, the user as against the architect. In terms of conclusions, I know our time is really getting away from me. So in terms of the outcomes of our study, we think that this would help people to really kind of maximize areas of high opportunity and, really think of, situating social housing in better communities to maximize social housing for both residents and occupants in all these different locations. Again, to establish and just really gauge visibility of projects like these. Also, with regards to maintenance, what we believe is an outcome is sort of like fivefold, where we believe that a study like this really helps the building's overall well-being by facilitating optimum performance in design, where we prioritize procedures, goals, and a kind of maintenance system where work is really quite defined. And so we just really hope that, this really helps to kind of point us in the right steps to take towards extending the life of social housing projects. In terms of how we've moved on from this study, in this study, we really focused on the user. And then we've gone on to do another study, which was concluded last year, 2021, where we took attention away from the user a little bit to those within the neighborhoods that were going to be kind of having to integrate these new developments. And so while it did show us some similar results, it really kind of opened us up to a new dimension of of how much information is out there available to really help us to design social housing the way it should be designed. I feel like on a conclusory note, like the users or those who occupy social housing really want to be involved in this process. Like if I just cast my mind back to our studies in Nigeria, there was so much enthusiasm and promptness in participation, despite being disappointed by the Nigerian government several times. Like they still came out to want to really be a part of what could be a new move towards delivering what they really desire. So I feel like it's really time to bring users and bring residents up front and center in the design of social housing. Thank you. I think I'll end it on that note so I don't really
Thank you.
Maria.
Can you please stop sharing your screen so we can see you? So thank you very much for this very thorough and deep presentation. I am so sorry that we didn't have all the time in the world to have a very extended conversation. And for me, and I think for everybody here in the room, it was very enlightening really to get this deep analysis on this topic. And I have to say that from my own experience, I have very superficial knowledge on this topic because it's not my area of expertise, although I come from Portugal, which is a country that also has very specific politics of social housing, also depending on the city. So, and it has been also evolved and changed over the years since after the revolution in '74, and then a bigger boom around the '90s and 2000s. So we had also in Portugal different stages and also different approaches to the topic of social housing. So it's very interesting also to learn from you also these different perspectives, and also see your awareness also of the different approaches, political, economical approaches to the topic. What I found specifically interesting and so valuable about your rich contribution is this focus on the user, and not just on the user as someone who experiences and who needs to have of course, housing to which they are effectively connected, that reflects also their, not just their lifestyle, but also their aspirations, their needs, and not just the fulfillment of basic human needs, also really providing people with places that they themselves feel they can thrive on, and that also probably reflect them or who they are. So I found that specifically interesting about your presentation, and also this idea of the importance of user participation in the process already from the very early stages. And this is also probably, maybe that would be the first question I would have for you now. If you can give any more concrete examples of one case study or different case studies where you noticed that the wishes of the people who wanted to be involved from the beginning, how these wishes were heard, how they were paying attention, and how did they manifest in the design? Could you give some examples?
Absolutely, thanks, Maria. So, I mean, the way social housing has really progressed now globally is taking on, while it's slow, it's kind of getting to where we want it to be in terms of hearing the voices of others. You know, so there's an example in France, it's called Tête en l'air. It's one of the more kind of popular social housing developments where actually it was developed on brownfield. So there was an existing community that had just this vacant land. And they also had complaints from people in the neighborhood who were having issues affording their rent, you know, and then they came together as a community and said to themselves, you know what, if these people can't compete on the market and we have this land, let's see how we can develop it into social housing so that they can still live in this community where they'd like to live but can no longer afford. But now in a place where still affords them the exact same kind of amenities and services and everything that they had initially. So that was the start of the design of Tête en l'air, where it was really more community driven than a plan of the government to do something there. It was really about the people. And while it has happened and it was quite very successful, even till now, people still make reference to Tête en l'air in France. It was quite a very popular development. The thing is, it hasn't quite gained traction, you know, because there are more governments than not that like to lead in those decision-making levels where they decide where the land is, they decide what kind of structure goes on it, how many floors, how many units, you know, and they decide every single thing about how social housing is developed. But we've seen in so many cases where this hasn't been a suitable response to social housing. So this idea that Tetenleer, you know, manifested and showed us that was a successful example, you know, has been copied in several different contexts and have succeeded. But again, it just shows how resistant the government is to a kind of bottom-up approach, which is more favorable to the people than to the government. So what happened was, you know, the people came together, created kind of like groups and spokespeople. It was a very organized process. Like we adopted something similar and then kind of modified it in our own study as well, because we also had to gather people together to kind of hear from them. So we also did the same thing. We identified, you know, kind of the more dominant figures in the community who would be spokespeople for the entire neighborhood. And we kind of met with them on fixed days to just hear them. People want to be heard. Like it surprised me the extent to which they knew what they wanted from social housing. It was very detailed. People spoke of wanting to live in social housing developments that had fences, you know, that had a kind of, you know, had roads. Yeah, because social housing developments in Nigeria don't have access roads. You know, it's so congested that they think that because people are very disadvantaged, they are probably pedestrians. But the people who kind of move up in opportunities, and because it's not quite designed to accommodate this change with them, they are forced out of those places and they can't still afford market rates. You know, so that there's so many things that these contexts where we see that it was more community-led or user-led that were very successful and just had a very clear and straightforward pattern that allowed the process to be extremely beneficial and yielded kind of positive results across the board.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's really, actually, you already answered my second question. My second question was, and how precise were these wishes? So they really already could imagine features of the design and things they wanted.
Maria, it was extremely specific. You know, people spoke of having sidewalks, like they wanted to just live like decent human beings. You know, like they spoke about having buildings properly oriented, that, you know, like they had spaces that were dark very early in the day, because, you know, designs for social housing in, I want to say Nigeria, because I'm not sure the entire region, but in that part isn't giving that much thought in terms of this design. You know, the government says to the architect, you know what, this is a limited budget project. You need to work within the means. So the architect goes to the design, has an idea in mind, something very cheap, literally just bangs it out on paper and has it done. And then also in terms of materiality, they just use whatever. So what you find with social housing in Nigeria is, as much as they aren't quite old, because we studied 4 social housing developments. One of them was built in, and then, I mean, across different decades. One was from 75, one was from 83, one was from 88, one was from 95. The one from the 90s is extremely dilapidated. It has completely deteriorated, because imagine starting up a project already using substandard materials or not designing for longevity or resilience. You know, so the product is bound to be problematic. So that's one thing we found, that, you know, these people are speaking and they're telling us things like, is it possible for us to even get our buildings painted every once in a while? Like, they were very specific, you know, like, and then, you know, the idea we have of, you know, people living in social housing being vandals or being problematic wasn't quite the image we got. Because among these people were also those who were saying things like, can we also have a way that, you know, density is controlled within the development? Because we see that people who came here as maybe a 3-person family have now gone up to like 8, 11, and is weighing on the amenities. So we moved into this development hoping to have access to water, access to electricity, but it's so overburdened that we lose access to all these benefits that we came here for. You know, so like these are people who are very aware and very conscious of what they are looking for, what they are seeking in these developments. You know, imagine people asking to have their homes walled, like they needed fences, they needed gates. Because, and another thing that happens with social housing in many contexts, not just in Nigeria, is this idea that, you know, there are criminals who live in social housing. And from what we saw, it wasn't quite the case. People who met us were people who were, you know, honorable members of the society who were participating in the ways that they could. They had small businesses, bakeries, you know, stores for mending shoes, mending clothes. You know, they had all these businesses of sustenance, and they were very responsible people. But what happens is that because the ones we studied, the developments we studied were not in poor neighborhoods, they were in middle income neighborhoods and higher income neighborhoods. So what happens in this case is that if there were ever any scenarios where people came to rob in those neighborhoods, because these developments aren't fenced, the criminal would immediately run into these developments and stay in one of the abandoned or vandalized units. You know, so eventually the notion of these areas being, you know, areas of high crime or home to criminals began to really sort of take form. And it wasn't of their own doing. You know, so it was just very interesting to see that a lot of those preconceived notions we have about social housing that makes us oppose them aren't really quite founded. If you look in depth to the situation that happens in social housing developments, there's a complete antithesis of what happens there and what we read about social housing. So, Maria, it was so interesting to find that there are actually really respected people that live in social housing developments, family men, you know, single parents who are just really working hard, focusing on trying to do well, you know, but because of, you know, and something else I found again with our study is that because these developments are so poorly taken care of, in some form, the onus of responsibility of caretaking rests on those who live there. So these are people who are disadvantaged, who make very little income and are still having to take care of the buildings. Like they're the ones who have to hire people who come to fix things. A pipe breaks down, a roof leaks, you know, the building is threatening to collapse. Something happens, you know, there's a drainage issue. They're still the ones who have to keep taking care of these developments. And this is not the agreement that they have upon, you know, commencing, you know, life in those developments. You know, because most times, initially, what happens with these people and the government is an agreement where the government says to them, you know what, you can live here, we'll take care of these developments. You might need to pay a stipend for maintenance or whatever issue it is. Either you pay and we have somebody come here and have those things sorted out, or you can do those things and then we pay you for taking care of these developments. But none of these things happen. So they're taking care of the developments out of pocket and are not being reimbursed and are just really having a harder time than they anticipated by living in a development like this. So it's really quite a sad thing to kind of watch and just see unfolding.
Well, I think it's very important that we have this conversation because we can learn so much from you and specifically address these prejudices that we can have if we only know the realities of social housing because of sensationalist news that we get through in the media, or just walking by or passing by with a car and feeling that perhaps because the buildings are not as well kept as we would hope for, that they are inevitably full of criminal people, like you just mentioned, when it's really not the reality. I have to say that from my experience also in Portugal, I went to a public school where I had colleagues from all different strata of society, all sorts of people. And I was invited to birthday parties by colleagues who were living in actual social housing units. And I experienced these people also, as you just mentioned, as honest, hardworking people who struggled and had modest lives. And what I noticed was that their interior lives were very well kept with whatever means they had. that they really treasured their possessions, they took care of them, and lived with the biggest dignity possible. And very often, unfortunately, the facades of these buildings would not reveal the richness and the dignity of the interior, which was also something that I have to say was a fortunate experience I had as a child, to see, not to trust just on the first appearances of things. We cannot continue with this conversation too long, unfortunately, but I would first ask here in the classroom if there would be a question. No? Okay, I think there would be many questions, but unfortunately we are very late here in Germany and it's very dark.
Yeah.
Yes, but I would like to ask in the audience, because we have also so many colleagues here who joined us, if there would be a question, I would be very glad, and I'm sure Chika Daniels also. I think Erku would like to make a question, right?
Not a very question, but I really appreciate the presentation. It's also very late here in Shanghai. I just happened to work on a deadline. It's 2 a.m., but I really enjoyed the presentation, and I'm really curious. I'm going to dig down that paper and I'll look and read it. I especially appreciate, and it resonates a lot, because I do work on phenomenology that I'm very interested in, and I appreciated the timeline that you show, starting from the feng shui and Taoist cosmology, which is also something that I'm very interested in. I actually did a master thesis on it. And also I think you really kind of talked about that experience, and it still is a question that what will be the tools that we should be using to communicate, other than like these qualitative kind of inquiries or observations. Would there be like anything that we can incorporate in our profession that we can just kind of use during these collaborative design processes? Those are the things that actually make me think about. But I was just like wondering that how you see that it will go beyond the research that you have done into actually like practice level, like when we design these spaces, these housing, and maybe not only confined to housing, but I think maybe the wider kind of practice of architecture. Thank you.
Absolutely. I don't know if I can respond to that, Maria. Can I?
You can.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Echo, for joining. I know it's so late. I'm sorry. It's so early here. It's just 11 a.m. here in Canada. So I'm sorry about that.
No worries. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you. So in terms of your question, absolutely. So one of the things that we developed last year was actually a policy document. So having spent time with both the user, and again now, because we did evolve from focusing on the user-centric studies to those who now lived in these communities. We suggested that social housing should be situated within. Because one reason why social housing is the housing of the future is because of where Harlow was suggesting it be situated. The thing that happens now more often is that they are always at outskirts or hinterlands where there's no access to them, and they can't really enjoy the cities. So they can't really add the value to cities that they should add if those developments were centered in the heart of cities. So what we've done now is, to look at high-income neighborhoods and study social housing developments within these neighborhoods, and now really focus on the wealthy residents and really just understand what exactly about social housing makes you oppose its construction within your community. So, and then mind you, we already have the information from the user on one hand, and now we're getting the information from the residents on the other hand. So this has helped us to really put together a very robust policy document where we're able to say, when you're designing social housing in non-poor communities, this is what needs to happen. This is how the design needs to look. This is what needs to be implemented. This is how you handle it. You know, so like it's a very clear breakdown of elements that need to be there. So now we're finding that you can satisfy the user and also satisfy the neighborhood residents who are on the outside of these developments. Because, you know, an issue that kept on recurring with social housing and having them be situated in non-poor communities is the issue of driving down property values because they were so poorly maintained. So now hearing from these residents helps us to be able to really design social housing in a way that it agrees with them. So the issue of opposition is very minimal or even, you know, eliminated entirely because, you know, you're satisfying the two sides of the fence. So I'm happy to share this with you, EQ, like in the future, so you can just see how much we've done in terms of really being able to really delineate what needs to be included or what needs to be guidelines towards designing for designing social housing developments, specifically in areas of high opportunity, which is non-poor communities.
So thank you. Thank you also, Erku, for being here, especially at late hours, and thanks also for your comment and your participation. And thank you so much, Chika, for being here. I would love to continue, but I really want to be respectful also of our students' time. And it was a great pleasure and also a wonderful contribution, very deep research, and really I learned so much. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your time with us and also sharing your knowledge.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Maria. Thank you, everyone, to the students. I'm happy to share the paper. I think it's actually online on academia if you wanted to just follow up and read. And then, EQ, you can send me an email if you wanted to, and then I could share with you this document that we've developed just for your own reading, for your reading pleasure. So sure. Thanks again, Maria. I'm happy to have been here.
Thank you so much, Chika. And also thank you everybody in the audience, and thank you here also in the classroom. So take care. Bye-bye.